Welcome to episode 7 of the Seasoning the Reasoning podcast. I'm Harry Sewell. My special guest today is Dr Lade Smith, known as Lade. Lade is a consultant psychiatrist at the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust and visiting senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, King's College London. She graduated in medicine from Guy's Hospital Medical School, London, winning prizes in psychological medicine. Having trained in psychiatry, she is now a forensic psychiatrist. She is clinical director of forensic services at SLAM. She is also the clinical director of the National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, providing medical leadership for the team developing mental health guidelines. Dr Smith was awarded a CBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours in June 2019 for services to Forensic Intensive Psychiatric care. In November 2019, she was awarded Psychiatrist of the Year by the Royal College of Psychiatrists and recently featured in HSJ's list of 100 influential BAME leaders. Hi Lade, great to see you again. It seems some time ago since we were working on the review of the Mental Health Act, and I kind of thought it was really serendipitous that this appointment had been put in the diary in December, and then it just so happened that today it coincided with the launch online of the white paper of the review of the Mental Health Act. So yeah, interesting. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks very much for asking me to do this. And yes, you're right, serendipity is definitely the word, because I think they only decided quite last minute actually to launch it today. So that's great.
Oh, great, thanks. Well, in this series, we kind of look at subjects related to issues of social justice. And, of course, you work in psychiatry and, have played a role in trying to kind of shape the future of psychiatry and mental health services more broadly in its response to people of minoritized backgrounds or racialized backgrounds or BAME, so many terms people use. And I was kind of struck that there's often a criticism of the medical model in mental health. And I wondered what you thought about the merits of that as a challenge that
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. I think that challenge is often made by people who perhaps have limited understanding of the training of psychiatrists and what we do. So I have been doing psychiatry for 28 years. And certainly in my training and the training of my colleagues, it was very much what I would call a biopsychosocial model, actually. And in fact, the big debates when I was training, growing up in psychiatry, were really between so-called social psychiatrists and then the more biological psychiatrists. But even the biological psychiatrists were looking at psychological processes and how they might link to what might be happening in the brain. So there was never this idea that, certainly when we were, trained and still now, there was always the idea that it was about the whole of a person and how their social situation interacted with their emotional and psychological state and how that might impact on their biological function and how biological aspects of their physical being impacted on their, psychological state. So, good example, classic example actually is anxiety. When people are anxious, there's the psychic anxieties, there's the worry and the ruminations, and that is, linked to an underlying physiological process that includes people have, huge amounts of adrenaline, and your adrenaline will be, shot out into the bloodstream, and that makes your heart race, and it makes you have butterflies in your stomach, and it makes you feel dizzy, and you might get sweating hands. So the psychological processes are intimately linked with the biological ones, and of course your psychic anxiety is linked to usually what's going on in your social situation. You're in debt, or you're about to get evicted, stuff like that. So the idea that somehow you'd ignore the fact that someone's about to, get evicted, and ignore the fact that someone feels like and anxious, only care about, oh, well, you've got a racing heart and you've got butterflies in your stomach, I'm going to give you some diazepam. It's just a fallacy, actually. So in terms of your question, what do I think of the merits of that challenge? I would say I think it's based on limited information, and I think it's outmoded and out of date. About certainly in my experience, it's about 30 years out of date.
Oh wow, okay. And I was kind of really interested in the analogy, or it's not even an analogy, it was a illustration you gave around anxiety, and that's really helpful. I wondered, and it kind of made me wonder whether or not when we say biopsychosocial, which kind of effectively puts no weighting on one perspective or another, I wondered whether or not in reality, in people's lived experience, it feels to them as though it's kind of psychosocial, or whether or not there's some kind of emphasis. And one way I kind of explore that question, and I'd be really interested in hearing your response, because it might be a really simplistic notion, but I kind of imagine in a multidisciplinary meeting before a discharge or planning for discharge, if someone's accommodation hadn't been secured, as in their tenancy was arranged but there was just some kind of fine tuning left, I could imagine a conversation saying, actually, there's pressure on beds, I understand they've got a cousin, they could kind of stay with their cousin for a couple of days, and then they can kind of get their flat, because we've got agreement from the housing association that they'll definitely get the tenancy by 5 days time, whatever it is, and we do a stopgap, and the social life wouldn't be that secure. I've heard it, I've seen it, I could imagine it. But I couldn't imagine a circumstance where we might say, well, actually, this person's not going to be able to have access to their medication, for a few days or for a couple of weeks, and we would discharge anyway, because there's so much privilege or priority given to the kind of biological side of the support for individuals. And I wondered whether or not you would recognize that as a reasonable way of saying, actually, there is still quite a lot of priority, perhaps understandably from your perspective, but a lot more priority given.
I think actually it's interesting you say that. So I'm not sure that's necessarily true, because what that does is I think it is somewhat simplistic, because it implies that because it would be dependent on the individual, and it'd be dependent on their medication. So, for example, if someone needed a medication just as required, PRN. So, for example, paracetamol. You have a headache today, you might, or a bit of a pain, you might take it. You don't necessarily need to take it regularly, something like that. Then it wouldn't be important. But there are some conditions, like, for example, if you have a thyroid disorder, you have an underactive thyroid, you have to take your medication for that underactive thyroid every single day. You can't miss doses, because if you miss doses, then actually it has quite a profound effect on your thyroid state. Actually, thyroid disorder is a really good example. Hypothyroidism is very closely and linked with the development of depression, actually. And in fact, you can get really, really, really severe depression, to the extent that people can develop depressive psychosis and become catatonic.
Right, okay.
So again, that's one of those kind of biopsychosocial things. The biological bit's really important, because if you don't take your regular, you have to take thyroxine, actually, never mind anything else, but let's say you don't take your thyroxine, you'll get ill. But in addition to that, in the case of somebody, needing to, if someone's social situation was such that, for example, if you said, if we send them to their cousin, then actually that's going to make them deteriorate, they're going to come back into hospital, then you wouldn't send them to their cousin. But if it was going to be okay, then you would. So I think that there's much more nuance, and there's much more individual tailoring that goes on in the day-to-day practical aspects of psychiatry. It's not simply, you've got to take your, okay, look, there are poor psychiatrists. You might just say, you've got to take your medication. I don't care about whatever else is happening in your life. I don't care about your bereavements. I don't care about the fact you're living in a car, then that would just be poor psychiatry. I think it's unfortunate that the bad psychiatry and the bad psychiatrists, and those of you who are going to say there are so many of them, I'm sorry if that's your experience, but I would say that, all too often poor psychiatry is put up as the example of standard psychiatry, and I don't think that's fair.
This is great, and I guess because we've kind of worked together, I feel like I can kind of ask these questions because I'm curious. It's not even as though, I have a preset response I'm trying to evoke. I'm actually kind of really, really curious. Because when you said that about the, bad psychiatrist, and knowing what you know about how racism is often kind of seen as, oh, but that was just a bad police officer in the States, and you might kind of think, well, actually, you've got a system that's designed that, like, how come you've got so many, or there's something about the protocols or the underlying assumptions that mean it isn't just, a bad officer because you've got so many of them. I wondered whether or not for people who have experienced, I don't know, some disenfranchisement in relation to the psychiatric system, whether they would say it's the equivalent that you might say, okay, yeah, you've got one or two, poorly performing individuals, but does that tell us something about the system is my question.
I'll tell you what it tells you about the system. It tells you that the system perhaps doesn't have sufficient checks and balances to account for those who don't do their job well. Okay. That is a different thing to saying that the system engenders people doing bad things to others. And that's important, actually. That's important because all too often the assumption is made that actually people who go into the mental health system, I'm not just talking about doctors, I'm talking about everybody who works in mental health, is essentially are a bit psychopathic. If not, you're either a bit psychopathic or very psychopathic, meaning that you're in it to hurt people. I just want to be absolutely clear. It could not be further from the case. There is something that happens to people, which is that over time they become burned out and demoralized. And that is actually the reason for that is pretty simple. I mean, it doesn't happen to everybody, but it happens to some people. And the reason for that is pretty simple, which is that people have been, actually, it's very the simple answer is 1 in 4 people have mental health problems. 25% of the population, the adult population, has a mental health problem. 11% of the health budget is spent on mental health problems. What that tells you is that just in and of itself, people are perhaps have got twice as much demand to deal with. That's 200% of the demand, and it means that everybody is constantly firefighting, and after a while, when you're constantly firefighting, you don't have enough resources to provide as good a care as you need to. Then what happens is that you either walk away from it and don't do it, which unfortunately people do, so we lose good practitioners, or you stay and you get used to, you become inured to, well, this is all we can manage. And I think that there is something that doesn't mean the system causes people to, or causes the bad psychiatry. Well, actually, I can put it this way. What it means is that there aren't sufficient checks and balances. It means that people are working in a system that is not sufficiently resourced. That lack of resource means that poorer practices can almost creep into people's work, I suppose. When it comes to, if you're a racialized minority in mental health services, the biggest problem is where you are. And there's a massive kind of postcode lottery. And even within the same trust, the mental health trust, you could have one service, one unit in the mental health service that is just doing wonderful and lovely things. Then the unit next door, everybody's burned out and doesn't really care. And sometimes you'll see people will say, I was fine. People often say, I really like my doctor. I really like that Dr. Smith, but I don't like that Dr. Jones, and I don't want to go anywhere near Dr. Jones. They're working in the same area, in the same service. The fact that happens so often tells you that there is something about there's something about the individuals, but there is something about the system. But it's not that the system necessarily engenders or forces or encourages, is the word, actually encourages people to be hateful towards others. I think the issue is that there isn't sufficient resourcing, and that can result in really almost a kind of diminution in what's available in terms of, psychic resources and everything else. You're on mute, Harry. Phrase of the century.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And yeah, just for the record, for anyone listening, the fictional names of Dr. Smith, I know you're Dr. Smith, and Dr. Jones that you use were for illustrative purposes only.
Yeah.
Just to clarify that, not looking for any libel cases right now. So, okay, that leads in a way to the next kind of areas, kind of looking at racism in mental health. And it's often discussed as, there's racism in society and in people's lives that shows up in their presentations, and that there's a correlation, if not a causal relationship, between racism and their presentations. And then racism is also discussed in relation to an extension of what we're talking about, that actually there's something in the design of psychiatry and of the mental health system more widely that is fundamentally racist. And you'll probably know that some of my critique kind of leans in that direction. But I was kind of again just been really curious to see whether or not you think racism shows up in both those ways or.
So I do think it's really, and I don't know who's going to be listening to this, but it's really important to distinguish between the different types of racial discrimination that occur. And I know people kind of think, oh, for goodness me, we know, we know what this is. We know what racism is. Everybody understands that discrimination is when you, have prejudice against another individual, and or not just an individual, but you have prejudice based on assumptions about the abilities and the motivation, intentions of others. And it might be according to their gender or their sex, but what we're concerned with in our discussion is that there are negative assumptions according to people's race, and there are different types of racial discrimination and different types of racism. I say this because sometimes, well, not sometimes, it's just too often these things are all collated. And people need to understand that discrimination means that you don't just have the prejudice, but you actually, your behavior is different against other people because of those negative assumptions, because of those because of those prejudices, and it results in a lack of respect. These are the kind of individual things. A lack of respect, a devaluation, a kind of dehumanizing. And that can be on an individual basis, but it can also be on a group basis. So you literally, for a whole group of people, you don't respect them as much as you might respect another group of people. You think that they are less competent as a group. So every single individual from that group is also therefore not competent. And you don't feel that they are as human as the people from a different group. And so there's the individual, and that can be on an individual level, there's an institutional level, and it can be internalized. And the institutional, the more structural racism is when there's differential access for that whole group, because they are from a certain race. And it can manifest as a kind of inherited, almost like an inherited disadvantage. And it gets codified into the customs and the practices and the laws, which is why it's often hard to see. It's kind of invisible, but in fact, it manifests in access to, material conditions. So there's different access, differential access to to good quality education or sound housing. I think it's very, very much writ large in America, where whole neighborhoods are poor and everybody who lives in that neighborhood is Black. And that's a result of very, very, very long-standing policies that have literally put barriers in place to those Black people being able to live in better housing. Literally, the Jim Crow laws. You can't live here. You have to sit at the back of bus. Now, it's not as stark now in the US, and it's certainly not as stark in the UK. But there are still those invisible, and they are quite invisible barriers, particularly around access to power, and that might be the access to information, access to resources, having a voice. And I think the problem is that because they're hard, because we're so used to this is how things are, people have been brought up with the situation, this is just how it is. There is a belief and understanding that people from certain racialized minority groups are essentially, it's true that this is just how things are. These are people who just can't get on. It's something inherent about them, when really it's something about the structures and the institutions that have engendered that. Psychiatry, and I talked about power, the thing about psychiatry is we know that in psychiatry, the power differential between the doctor, the practitioner, and the patient is huge. In medicine, there is a power differential between the doctor or practitioner and the patient. There always has been. It's not so obvious with cancer care or with orthopedic surgery or whatever, because you have more of a say if you decide, I know I've got cancer, I know it says stage 1, and that if you cut it out now or you treat it now, I'll be fine, but I don't want the treatment. And you can say no to that. It is different in psychiatry, because actually if someone says, well, it's all very well you saying you want to kill yourself, but we think it's because you're depressed, and we're going to section you even though you just want to go home and kill yourself. We're not going to let you do it. And some people would argue and do argue that actually if that person really feels that they have nothing to live for, then they should be allowed to take their life. And this is and it becomes difficult because there's a big power differential. In the fact is that if you have stage 4 cancer and you want to go to Dignitas, you can do that. You can go and take your life. But if you're depressed and you come across a psychiatrist, that psychiatrist might well section you. So there is the very nature of psychiatry is it if you like, it magnifies that power differential that already exists between doctor and patient. And I think sometimes the difficulty is that there isn't for the practitioner who's really busy, hasn't got time to think it all through because they've been thinking it through for years before anyway. There isn't as much mindfulness of how it feels for the individual who's at the end of that, because actually, especially when people, are faced with, being sectioned for the first time, it's shocking, I think, to discover that, guess what, somebody else can take away your autonomy like this. Yes. And some people are really good and have the time to talk through that, and some people don't do it so well.
And in your response, especially with things like housing, you described using illustrations, real, clear ways in which racism kind of shows up in people's lives, and the kind of relationship with presentations to mental health services is probably, pretty evident to most. In your description of, say, power, I wasn't sure whether or not you saw a racialized element in that, in kind of responding to that second part about whether you think that racism shows up in the way that the mental health system functions, and again, not just thinking of a discipline within it.
So I think that mental health, so psychiatry, mental health are institutions within the society that in which we live, and the society in which we live is a society that minoritizes people. And there is, whether we like it or not, there's a kind of prejudicial hierarchy. And I think that if you are a good practitioner, you are always aware of that. One of the I think one of the difficult things and the challenges, if you like, is when it is always to have that in mind, Because if you try and pretend, well, not necessarily pretend, but if you go about your business thinking that there aren't these institutional factors at play and there aren't these structural factors at play, then what you don't accept is that the person sitting in front of you, no matter what type of person they are, if the person sitting in front of you is a patient, then immediately there's a power differential. If that person happens to be female, there's an additional power difference that they've had all their lives. If that person happens to be Black, there's another layer. So there's the intersectionality of that. And it can be complicated to think about and complex to think about, but you have to think about it, and you have to if you like, make allowances for that and think through that more carefully, because the person who's sitting before you has already been impacted by those structural and institutional factors. And what you might be doing within your practice is inadvertently making those things worse, because you are not taking into account those structural difficulties, those structural factors, and you are not necessarily fully understanding your own, how you yourself have been influenced by those long-standing institutional discrimination and racism, actually.
No, that's so helpful, really, really clear. And I smile because I've been writing about this concept of toxic interaction theory for a number of years. First appeared in my first book in 2008-9, and I've kind of been revising it. And in fact, I've got to a point now where I've got a lot more clarity about what I want to say, and I'm writing a document now, which is going to be launched on the 7th of April. Which basically makes the point that you've just made, which is, often it's that kind of inadvertent lack of acknowledgement or validating the reality of people's lived experience, from their point of view, and to know that those prior experiences come into the room. So we end up reenacting power dynamics. But because to us, it's not an issue, not you and I, but as practitioners, it's not an issue. We don't really talk about it, and unless the person brings it into the space intentionally, we think, well, okay, it's not troubling because they haven't brought it there. And some people say to me, oh, I'm not going to ask someone about their experience of racism. I kind of just make sure that I'm very open, and if they want to talk about it, then I make sure that I provide a context where they feel unable to do that, and it kind of puts the onus back on the other person. And I often use the example that if we were concerned about suicidal ideation as practitioners, we wouldn't just sit there and think, right, okay, I've got this concern in the back of my mind, but I'm not going to mention it because I'm going to be person-led. Because we know the detriment that is caused by not bringing that into the space, we've got a moral and ethical and professional obligation to do that. And I think that racism and sexism and homophobia and all the other kind of forms of discrimination that are structural and interpersonal also are of that standing that we need to bring it into the space.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, actually. I think it's a very good example about suicide. But again, probably about 30 years plus ago, it used to be the case that you didn't ask about suicide because the belief was that if you asked about suicide, it would put the idea into somebody's head and make them want to kill themselves. So I don't know if you remember that. I mean, that idea was still around when I started. So I think that's a really good example. Then someone did the research, said, actually, just the opposite. In fact, if you ask people, they're going to tell you and you can intervene. Yeah. Likewise, again, I remember really, really, really well doing my part 2 of the big psychiatric board exams, Royal College of Psychiatrists, and it was only at that time, and this contrasts with doing my part 1, which I think I'd done a couple of years earlier, and by part 2, sexual abuse, you had to ask about it, whereas when we were doing part 1, I mean, it's not a clinical thing, but certainly around that time, you didn't ask about sexual abuse. What you did was you were open enough, and if the person disclosed something to you, then that was fine. But actually, by part 2, there was so much debate about it. What we were expected to do was obviously be open, what we had to do is if someone disclosed something, you'd actually have to, write it down. You get into science, and it was all really a bit like getting consent for an HIV test when people were doing having to get consent before all changed again. But there's something about what happens over time and people's understanding, and I think it's a work in progress. I think it's going to be the same kind of thing. It was before. It was people's understanding was, if someone's got a problem, they'll talk about it. We're now moving to the time when I say to all my trainees, have you asked them about their experience of racism, because it's a form of emotional trauma, and in some cases it's a form of physical trauma. It's really, really important that we start asking. It's not yet become standard practice, but I think soon it will become standard practice. And the other thing, very importantly, that will become standard practice is people having training to understand that actually when the person comes into the room, it's not a level playing field. Even if you were talking to Lord Fauntleroy, who Lord Fauntleroy in that situation, who has got 60 million pounds and could buy your house 15,000 times over. When that person walks into the room and they have a mental health problem and you're the practitioner, that power, you are still in a position of power compared to them. And if Lord Fauntleroy happens to be black, doubly so.
That's great. Thank you. Very quickly, before I ask my next question, you mentioned about women and women's experiences, and I'm aware, particularly because of the work that I do, that there's a lot of priority given to the variations and probably inequalities that affect young black men and older black men. Do you think that the experience of black women or minoritized communities, the experiences are overlooked in policy and public debate?
I do think that black women are more invisible, and it's interesting because I think that I actually have to say I think it's a very complex area. I think that it is a whole other podcast. There is something about the fact that I don't know if people fully get this, but black women have also got high rates of detention, higher than expected. Black women are also more likely to be offered medication and not be offered psychological therapy, just like black men. The rates of black men being in the higher end of services, in the secure services and forensic services, I think is much more obvious because frankly it's more costly, and the cost of a secure bed is way more than the cost of someone being in a general unit who's informal, and who's there voluntarily versus someone who's in the secure psychiatric bed and they're there involuntarily. I think that has something to do with it. I think that black women, there's evidence increasingly that clearly black women are suffering in silence. There's a great deal of anxiety and depression in the black population and black female population in particular, 4 times the rates in white British people. And that's what that was shown by Stephanie Hatch. But it's not something that is it's only really something, I mean, she did that work a few years ago. It's only something that's really becoming more and more talked about now. I mean, I talk about it every time I have a chance to get, but I think that it's all based on long-standing stereotyped assumptions about black people don't get depressed, they don't get anxious, they just get psychotic. And people's understanding of psychosis is poor. People think it means being violent, and that very much fits with the narrative that black men are violent. So the focus is on black men who are violent and they must be psychotic. And actually, so much of that is incorrect. Psychosis doesn't mean being violent. It's not it's rarely associated with violence. Psychosis literally just means being detached from reality, and it's characterized by having delusions and hallucinations. If you are Mrs. Jones, sorry about the Joneses, anyway, Mrs. Jones, and you live at 10 Acacia Avenue, but you think you're the Pope, then you are definitely suffering with some kind of psychosis. Do we care? No. I've got to be honest with you. If you're happily going about your life, but you still happen to think you're the Pope and you're not bothering anybody, you know, you're looking after yourself, you're looking after your space, you're looking after you, you know, you're getting on with your life, you're getting on with your job, you're not, spending all your money on, trying to buy a Pope-mobile or something, and, whatever, and ending up in massive debt and causing problems for yourself. No one's really going to mind. And there are plenty of people out there who are like that. It becomes a problem when you think I'm, the Pope and I've got to die to save the world, and you go to the top of the car park, throw yourself off. That's when people get worried.
Thank you. Thanks, Lade. And just so you know, I've reached out to our dear colleague Dawn Edge to have a podcast specifically on that issue about are Black women excluded from public and professional perception about these racialized inequalities. So hopefully our listeners will get a full episode of on that.
I think that's excellent. I think that's really, really, really good. Maybe it's a question of it's the the loudest, it's the cog that squeaks that gets the oil kind of thing, because it's just much more obvious with Black men. But there are lots of complex things that are going on that mean that Black women don't get the input that's needed. Definitely.
Okay. Absolutely fascinating, and it's really genuinely really brilliant having this conversation with you. But I want to go full circle, because at the start I mentioned that today was the launch of the white paper on the reform of the Mental Health Act, and we were both involved in it, you more than I. Do you think that legislation has the ability to kind of bring about some change in terms of the racial disparities? Can the law achieve that?
Well, it's interesting you to say that. Of course, I have to say yes, because I've just been involved in developing some reforms that I very, very much hope will make a difference. I think the difficulty comes when if you don't understand the complexities and the issues that underpin why there are racial disparities, then what you do is you just write a law that says don't discriminate, full stop. Right, which is actually what we have at the moment. So the Equality Act 2010 says don't discriminate against people, regardless of what their protected characteristics. Don't discriminate, just don't do it. The difficulty with that is that what it doesn't do is account for all those people who don't realise that they're discriminating. It doesn't account for, on an individual level, because we know that people have unconscious bias. It doesn't account for those institutional factors that have resulted in in policies and procedures that are actually engendering some of the differences between people, like the housing project thing. People may not realise that those policies actually impact, create structural inequality. And so a law that's just blanket, just don't do it, won't work for factors that are much more, for things that are much more complex. What we try to do in the Mental Health Act reform, and when we were doing the review and developing our recommendations, and Harry, you will know we had plenty of debate. We looked at all the evidence as much as we could. We talked to huge, loads and loads of different people with lived experience, carers and service users. We talked to health professionals. We talked to people who haven't had experience, who had an idea. We talked to academics. We talked to loads of different people. We asked people about all their different experience, took all the evidence together, and then we thrashed it out. You remember? And just to let everyone know, there was lots of debate. It's amazing, actually. We didn't beat each other up, which is pretty good. But and we came from everyone in the room was from a different kind of background. So it was very disparate backgrounds. And we managed to reach a consensus because, and I think I was thinking about this, how can we manage to reach consensus? And that's because there was just no getting away from the fact that this wasn't some genetic problem that Black people have. That was pretty clear early on. This was not simply about, all psychiatrists being racist. That was pretty clear early on as well. And it became clear that actually there were things happening very early in people's lives. And then we start to realize this is historical. There's no doubt at all, this is historical. Those historical things have unfortunately resulted in structural and institutional processes that are so ingrained that it's really hard to unpick them. But it's only when you turn around and you say, oh my goodness me, these things exist, that you can start to try and, it's not dismantling the whole structure of society, but it's shifting the way we approach policies and procedures, and therefore shifting the way that we approach, shifting those structural barriers and structural factors. And so what we've done with the Mental Health Act reform is to make recommendations about laws that will focus not directly on, right, psychiatrists, you have to stop, you can only section 15 people in a year, take your pick. That wouldn't be helpful. Instead, what we've done is we've actually focused our recommendations around, hopefully that will be come into some of the rules and code of practices in the law that will actually engender structural change. And I think that's where it's a bit more clever than just saying, right, psychiatrists don't section people, because that wouldn't solve our problem, because there'd still be institutional factors. And what would end up happening is that people who got really, 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 really unwell, because actually Black people get unwell as much as anybody else, might end up, unfortunately, in prison instead of in hospital.
That's brilliant. That's really, really great. Thank you so much, Lade. And yeah, some of what you said echoes the podcast I did with Craig Morgan. Kind of, obviously, once I mention his name, we're going to be thinking about society and the kind of restructuring that is needed in society. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. Definitely we'll do this again.
Great. That was great speaking with Lade. One of the great things about the way in which Lade presents and thinks through challenges is the fact that she's very precise and also seeks to ground what she says in an evidence base. It's striking, for example, the conversation about what it means to be admitted for psychosis, and kind of really making that point that it isn't psychosis itself, but levels of risk. And ideas like that are really helpful in the debates where sweeping generalizations are often used, and it's great to find someone who is so keen to keep us grounded in the science, but not to just rely on the science that is given prominence, but also including the lived experiences of people who have their stories to tell. So it's great. If you want to check in with any more of the Seasoning the Reasoning podcasts, search Seasoning the Reasoning on your favourite platform to listen, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.